Well, I'll go ahead and kick us off because I know it's 4 o'clock and we want to honor everyone's time here today. So welcome everyone to today's webinar on social and emotional learning practices for students. I'm Stacy Hsu. I'm the Senior Director for Professional Learning here at Michigan Virtual. Before we get started, I just have a few announcements. First, a reminder that in order to receive Michigan Sketches, state continuing education credit hours, you will need to be in attendance the entire time, and you must be individually logged in using the credentials from the email you received when you registered. Also, just a reminder to please allow 10 business days for sketch processing. And finally, I want to take this opportunity to tell you a little bit about Michigan Virtual. We're a nonprofit organization with the mission of advancing both learning and teaching through research, practice, and partnerships. We are proud to offer this professional learning opportunity in partnership with Mindful Practices and its founder, Carla Tantillo Philibert. So welcome, Carla. Last week, Carla shared so many ideas and resources with us around adult social and emotional learning and well-being. But don't worry, if you were not with us, you can access any of these webinars anytime by visiting michiganvirtual.org/SEL-webinar. And with that, I want to welcome back Carla, and I'm so excited to learn today. Hi, Carla.
Hi, Stacy. It's so good to see your face, my friend. And I want to take this opportunity to say how grateful I am to Stacy, to Anne, to Ken, to the innovative Michigan Virtual team. We are so excited to be working with you all. And I am so grateful and honored to be here. And so we have, friends, we have an action-packed session today. And so we're going to kick it off. Again, I'm Carla Tantillo. I'm the founder of Mindful Practices. I started Mindful Practices in 2006 after I was part of a team that founded a high school in Chicago's La Villita, or Little Village neighborhood. We started this high school specifically to support students that were at risk or most vulnerable for gang violence or joining gangs. And I went on from there in 2006 to form Mindful Practices. And so Mindful Practices has been around for a while. We've been doing this SEL work for a while as boots on the ground supports to schools and districts. On average, we work with about 75 different schools and districts in both the United States and Latin America. And I say that because I know that the SEL space, there's a lot of Johnny-come-latelys. There's a lot of folks now that are flooding to the space. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you really concretely about practices I used as an educator, I used as an administrator, as well as I've worked arm in arm with my team and our stakeholders to develop with our partners. I've written some books on this, as you can see, and some of the strategies that I'm going to be sharing with you, as well as the visuals that I'm going to be sharing with you today, come from my Everyday SEL series on Routledge. I'm also the co-founder of the SEL check-in platform, Class Catalyst. I'm going to be talking a little bit about EdTech and EdTech resources today, and a lot about EdTech resources next week when we talk about school-wide implementation. I know that Michigan Department of Ed has been trailblazing in their work and their commitment to suicide prevention. We're going to talk about that commitment. We're going to be talking about that work a little bit today, and we're going to be talking about the power of ed tech tools like Class Catalyst to check in with every student every day so no student falls through the cracks. We'll also talk about the importance of using technology to connect with families, because connecting the dots between what's happening at home and what's happening at school is vital, especially as we all transition from this pandemic moment that we're in and the closing of the pandemic, knock wood, to what things will look like in the fall. And so a quick review of session one. Now, I loved, and Stacy and Anne, I heard from so many folks that were with us last week who emailed me with thoughts and questions. Tamra, Caitlin, Kyron, I had these amazing conversations with folks from wonderful districts across Michigan and from other states in the US. I'd like to, for folks that weren't joining us, I'd like to do a quick overview of the content from last week. If things are moving quickly, I'm going to give you my email address at the end. I strongly encourage you to reach out to me, as well as watch the recording from last week, which is available to you. Here are some quick pieces that we talked about last week. One is SEL work and equity work are not one and the same. Equity work must come first. it must be separate. There must be training and time dedicated to specifically to equity work. However, this is a yes and situation that social emotional learning work must be inclusive of anti-racist practices, culturally responsive practices, equity practices, as well as trauma-informed practices, which I'll talk a little bit more of today. Training for SEL is for every caring adult in your school building and is in SEL as a discipline. Training for caring adults in your school building in SEL is as social emotional learning. They're learning about social emotional learning. That is quite different than buying a curriculum and training folks in your school on how to use that curriculum. That's not SEL training. That's training in a curriculum. And so really differentiating between those two and being intentional about the training that you provide for every caring adult in your school building. That's paraprofessionals, aides, educators, staff, counselors, etc. And then remembering that we're all coming out of a pandemic, and social emotional learning starts with well-being. It starts with well-being because we're asking people to engage in self-inquiry, to look critically at their own lenses, their own biases, etc. And to also say they feel safe and comfortable exploring that awareness of self, exploring their ability to regulate or not. And so that starts by taking care of the caring educators that help our schools run. And so what are we doing today? We're going to practice our pop check. You'll notice that's a theme throughout. That's the experiential learning component of the session. We're also going to be reviewing our definition of SEL quickly. For more information on that SEL, unpacking that definition, you'll look at last week's session. We're going to define student SEL, looking critically at instructional time, non-instructional time, usage of time in general. We're going to look ahead to the fall, and then we're going to wrap, as we did last week, with, hey, where can I help you? Where do you need support? And so really thinking as we go, if you have questions, putting those questions to Stacy in the chat, or starting to draft an email, putting those questions to me in an email. I will get back to you, friends, within 48 hours, because supporting you beyond this session, beyond our series, that's my life work. That is where the strength of professional learning and the strength of professional development comes. We know it doesn't come from a one and done session. It comes from me working with you, for you having support from colleagues and friends throughout this SEL journey. And so we're going to start with our pop checks. I'm going to ask that you push chairs back. Those of you who are like me, who've maybe been seated all day or a big chunk of the day, please stand up. And so take a moment to stand up, stretch, like, whew. How do you feel in the body? And so we're going to find our feet. We're going to roll our shoulders back, friends. We're going to roll our shoulders forward. We're going to sit up tall. Notice if your hands are busy. Are you checking that phone? Are you checking that last email? Can you give yourselves a minute to just be? Yes, all those things are important, but this is your moment. Just be. Release the tongue from the roof of the mouth. Release the throat and the jaw. Now, always engaging in trauma-informed and culturally responsive practices here, we never mandate that eyes are closed. And so pick a spot in front of you to focus on. Closing the eyes only if it feels accessible to you. Breathing. As you're here, notice, observe. What are you bringing into our session today? You're happy, you're sad, you're stressed, you're tired. You're thinking about what to make for dinner tonight. Like, where are you? And do so from a place of being an observer, not from a place of evaluating yourself like, tisk, 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 shame on me. No, you're just noticing. You're just checking in. There's no pass. There's no fail. And so for our pop check, we pause. We find our breath. We own whatever we're experiencing in this moment, thoughts, feelings, emotions. And then what we're going to do is practice a 4 or 5 breath together. I'll count to 4. We'll pause at the top of that inhalation for 2 beats, and then we'll exhale for 5. Extending that exhalation longer than the inhalation has a calming impact on the nervous system. And so when we're ready, finding our breath and inhaling 1, 2, 3, 4, pausing, 1, 2, and exhaling 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Beautiful, friends. Let's do that one more time. Inhaling 1, 2, 3, 4, pausing. Exhaling 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Beautiful. Now, if your eyes are closed or your gaze is focused, before we resume our session, notice how that was for you. Did it resonate from the start? Did it take a second? Did you check your phone? Did you giggle? And wherever your point of entry was for this practice, honor that. Be curious about it. Say, oh yeah, I did giggle, or oh yeah, I did check my phone. Why? Right? Or no, hey, I was plugged in the whole time. And so again, operating from a place of curiosity. And then as I encouraged us in the first session, grab a pen and take some notes, both for questions that you might want to put in the chat. You might want to throw in an email to me or to Stacy, but also because I'm going to be walking through some practices here. Now you will be able to watch the recording and practice these on your own, but it's always nice to be analog, especially because we're so plugged into digital. And so I love having paper and pen close to you to take some notes. That way those notes are with you. They can go up on the fridge. You can tape them next to your laptop. They're close by. They're not one of like the million links that you receive a week or even you'll receive with us. And so again, when we think of pop check, we're thinking about this as a lifelong practice, a practice that develops what we call, or what is called by Castle, what is called by Jennings as the SEC, which is your social emotional competence. And so looking at the building of your social emotional competence, and that's something that comes through practice over time. It's not something you learn. It's not something that you master. It's not a box that you check. But for adults and students, developing SEC is something that you learn and develop over time. We think of it as a lifelong practice that starts with a pause, checking with breath and awareness, moves on to that owning it, right? That voice and connection, and then a practice, the choice, agency, and positive identity. This last piece we're going to be really diving into today, especially when we think about student-centered SEL. What is SEL? What does social emotional learning look like for students? And as Castle recommends, and as we're going to talk about today, that social emotional learning for students is rooted in voice, it's rooted in choice, agency, and it's rooted in that connection with a caring adult that leads to the development of positive youth identity. And so quickly now, with your pen in hand, I'm going to ask you to journal for just a second. Would the landscape of SEL in our schools change if we listen to students? So would the landscape of SEL in our schools change if we listen to students? And so you're going to journal just a sentence or two quickly now. And then I'm going to ask you to put that sentence or two in the chat. Maybe it's a yes, maybe it's a no, maybe it's a, hey, we do this in our building, we do this in our district, it really has an impact. Students are constantly informing our SEL practices and processes. And so putting that now, moving that from your journal, adding that to the notes. And then Stacy, I'm going to ask you, friend, what are you seeing in the chat? Are you seeing people say like, yes, no, it would change, it wouldn't change, like it would be transformative? What are you seeing?
I'm seeing a lot of yeses, and I think it would absolutely, when you listen, you learn. Yeah, students would give an understanding of felt safety and belonging. Lots of it is beneficial. Feel more valued. Students would feel more valued. So yes, 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 certainly.
Awesome. Now, Stacy, we remember, friends, that later on in the session, we're going to be giving away some Starbucks gift cards. So friends, this is just a warm up your participation in the chat. Be ready, because I'm going to say, all right, Stace, who's in the chat? Whose voices do we want to hear? Because even though there's 500 people with us today, we want to make sure that we're connected to you. We're hearing your voices. We're listening. And so what we're going to do now as we talk about student-facing SEL is we're going to hear from some students. Mindful Practices and Class Catalyst put on a student voice summit about 2 weeks ago. I've included some clips here, and one of the reasons is these are students that come from different school partners we have across the country. Some of these schools really tap into student voice to inform their social emotional learning practices and have for years. Some are just starting, and you'll notice the myriad responses that come from students, whether they feel seen, whether they feel heard. And so let's take a peek here and then we'll watch more in a bit.
We've all heard adults tell kids, you have no reason to be stressed, you don't pay bills, you don't go to work. That's what I like to call toxic adulting. Although we might not pay bills or go to work, we go to school and we deal with other issues. Just because we're younger does not mean our issues should be minor compared to adults.
Pointing out the obvious, teachers aren't going to know what's happening at home with students, because unless students tell them, how could they? And a lot of times when there's things going on at home, kids don't want to talk about it.
High school is not the easiest stage and little chapter in our lives. So having someone that we feel like we could be ourselves and they are themselves with us is something that when I was in high school and even in middle school, I took with me till this day, and I carry it with me. My closest teachers, I still talk to, and they're like my biggest mentors and people that I know I could count on.
Okay, friends. Now I'm going to ask you to put in the chat, of those three students, the first, the second, or the third, which resonated most with you, what they shared. When you look at their stories, toxic adulting, awareness of what's happening with students, that positive connection, that positive relationship building that our last student, Winnie, shared. When he spoke about that connection with adults from middle school, from high school. Did you see and hear some of your own students and what they shared? Now, one of the reasons we're talking about this so in depth today, here we go. Hold on here. One of the reasons we're talking about this so in depth today is we have to look critically at what informs our student-facing SEL. Now, many of our school districts potentially purchased a curriculum and said, okay, we're going to train teachers on how to use the curriculum, and then we're going to implement that curriculum Wednesday, 2:15, done, boxes checked. And we have seen our suicide rates rise consistently for both students and adults year after year after year. We have seen student mental health needs rise consistently year after year. And so we know that that check the box approach doesn't work. And this gets us to our boilerplate agreement, friends. When we think about social emotional learning, we're not thinking about implementing a curriculum. That's part of it. But we're thinking about this as a multi-layered, multifaceted approach. We're sure a curriculum is a component, but SEL implementation doesn't start and stop there. And so let's take a look. SEL is not a curriculum that we administer every Wednesday. It's an approach, it's a process. We're also going to talk about and think about progress monitoring of SEL instead of mastery. As we talked about last week, when we look at the social emotional competencies, when we look at self-awareness and self-regulation or self-management, social awareness, when we look at these competencies, these three bedrock, if you will, the reason mastery is a discussion that falls flat, that's almost impossible to wrap our arms around, is because the context is constantly shifting for a student and for an adult. As I shared last week, my awareness here as a presenter, doing what I do every day, this is my jam, this is where I'm comfortable, I might be aware here because I'm relaxed. But if you put me at dinner with my mother-in-law, how does that shift? If you put me at dinner with a superintendent or in a meeting with a superintendent, how would that shift or change? Would I be as relaxed, less relaxed, more relaxed even? And so my ability to be self-aware is contingent upon the context. And so when we think about student social emotional learning and skill building, we're going to talk about it from the lens of progress monitoring. That's the work that we've done with our research partner, University of Chicago, Chapin Hall. And we're going to take that mastery conversation and we're going to put it over here. Because the very first question that I ask superintendents when they say, how are we going to check for mastery? I'm going to say, to what end? To what end? Why are you checking for mastery? So you can justify the spend to the school board. And how can we check for mastery in a way that's equitable, knowing that students have different entry points to this work? And so we're going to leave that mastery conversation here. And instead, for our time today, we're really going to dive into progress monitoring, and we'll tackle that more next week as well. We know, and we talked about, you've got to train your staff. And why do we have to train our staff? Our teachers are not trained social workers, nor do we want them to be. Teachers do amazing work. Social workers do amazing work. One does not have to be the other. However, if we ask students to share their story, adults have to be able to receive that story. They have to be able to receive that information that a student shares, understanding their own lens, understanding their own bias. And then in that moment, they have to think critically and clearly about how to best assist that student. That is why next week as well, we're going to talk about mandated reporter. We're going to say, hey, there is this system, mandated reporter, that is set up, right? What about abuse? What about neglect? We're going to tackle that next week. We think about whole school systems of support around SEL. But for today, we're going to say we've got to train our staff. And one of the reasons is that if we don't, then staff will not harness, they won't tap into student voice, because either A, they'll say, I'm not a trained social worker. I don't know what to do if this child comes to me and tells me something. So I'm going to avoid. If the student's sitting there with their hoodie up or they're sitting there looking upset, I'm just going to leave them alone, even though we know there's a need. Because we feel that we aren't trained, or we feel that we wouldn't be able to adequately meet that need. So we pretend it's not happening, and that's not okay. Or we lower expectations and we say, and now that I know this student's story, I won't have high expectations for them, which often, even though it's well-intentioned, perpetuates cycles where a student may or may not achieve because expectations are lower for them. And so what we have to do is be able to hold that student's emotional need and also hold high expectations for them at the same time. And that's why we train all adults, all caring adults in SEL as a discipline, so they know how to do that. We create authentic space for student voice, agency, and positive identity. And how do we do that? By designating time for this work, both from the non-instructional side and the instructional side. And we think about how to SEL with these two prongs: instructional time, non-instructional time. Now, is it more complicated in that? Will we address some of those complications next week? Sure. But this is what we're tackling today, friends. And we're going to think about how ed tech can be a useful tool in that, because ed tech can save us time. Now, if we think about that, we've got to think about how to be really informed connoisseurs of ed tech. And that's something that, again, we'll talk about next week. I'm giving us a little overview of next week because there's so much to talk about with student SEL. I don't want you to think I'm leaving anything out. I promise we'll get to it. And so, quick refresher for friends that are joining us for the first time today. What is SEL? Social emotional learning. We know this. We've seen the Castle definition. You'll notice here that I've highlighted process. I've highlighted children and adults. You'll notice here as well that we've got the Chicago Public Schools recent statement around SEL, recent mission and vision around SEL. I've highlighted some phrases for us, some word for us. You're seeing multifaceted. You're going to hear me say that. We've already talked about it can involve a curriculum, but it needs to be non-instructional as well. It can involve ed tech tools. It needs to include progress monitoring. It needs to include SEL skill building. We need to think about this development of these skills over time. And most importantly, we're looking at trusting relationships. And to build those trusting relationships, we need to take care of adults so they have emotional bandwidth for that relationship, as well as the training so they have the tools in their toolbox to not shy away from student voice or not shy away from a student in need. We notice here as well that CPS is saying we've got to address trauma, friends. This has to be culturally, linguistically, contextually responsive. We're talking anti-racist. We're talking equity here. And again, training up all caring stakeholders. Now, why include this? This is the third largest school district in the country, friends. So SEL isn't just being talked about now because we've identified a need. SEL is here to stay. And if the third largest school district in the country is saying that, we know other school districts are following suit. And so when we think about social emotional learning, I love this graphic here from my book, because what it does is it says we have to balance the intrapersonal with the interpersonal. How I know myself and how I interact and how I'm aware of those interactions with the folks around me. We think about this in the context of students. We see it all the time. We have a student who's sitting there and they come in to take a math test. And I'm their math teacher, and I know that they have all types of negative thoughts rolling around in their brains. They're not good at math. They hate math. They've never felt successful in math. So they sit down to take the math quiz, and the student next to them, potentially trying to cheer them up, potentially knowing they're stressed, starts clicking their pen. Click, 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 and bothering. So what happens? The student taking the test, who's already wrestling with testing anxiety and feelings of self-doubt, says, hey, stop it. Stop clicking your pen. Stop clicking your pen. The student isn't in a context where they've practiced self-awareness. They're not in a context where they're able to regulate because they're nervous, they're stressed, they're anxious. And so they punch the kid next to them, or they take the pen and they throw it across the room. So what happens? They get ejected from my math class, the very content they need to stay in. They miss the test, which lowers their grade even more. And we see very clearly here in this example how social emotional skill building is the building awareness of the self. Like, I'm feeling anxious right now. That is going to impede my ability to do well on this test. So what practices are at my fingertips to help me be calm, present, focused, or as Kane calls, relaxed alertness, to help me tap into that relaxed alertness. And then also to understand, to have that social awareness, to have those interpersonal skills, to speak to the student next to me who's clicking the pen in a way that's going to get them to like chill out and leave me alone for a second without causing a conflict, without interrupting the students around me. Now this, friends, what we're talking about here, this balance between intrapersonal and interpersonal, this is really doing school. There are some students who are astute, who have these skills mastered, that can balance the needs of the self and the needs of the social gracefully. And there's some students who just can't. And there's some adults, quite frankly, who just can't. And this is why training and skill building, voice, agency, and connection are vital, especially when we think about SEL skill building for students. Now, SEL implementation is not simple, and I'm saying that out loud. To do it right and to have a comprehensive, multifaceted approach is hard work. It's hard work. It's not as easy as buying the curriculum, implementing it on Wednesday, and checking the box. Because you implement the curriculum on Wednesday, it's out of context. The lesson's on bullying. So you hope some kids are getting bullied on Wednesday so then they can appreciate the lesson? No. So what we need to do is we need social emotional learning practices to be informed by the students that they're designed for. We need student voices to be heard so they can inform those lessons. And then we also need adults that are implementing this social emotional learning approach to inform the process as well, because they know their kids. And so if we're asking adults and students to form positive relationships, we have to make sure that both parties have voice and agency. As a dear friend of mine at Castle will say, how can we expect students to operate with agency if the adults that are teaching them don't feel that they have agency themselves? And he's right. And so what we have to do is we have to look critically at how we're implementing social emotional learning in schools, not just from the adult side like we talked about last week, but the student side as well. Are we just looking to check the box? Or do we have social emotional learning practices that are reflective of the students that are sitting in front of us? Here I am at 3. Pool pass, cute, potentially. I had emotional needs. Now, nothing big and terrible and whoa happened to me, but I had emotional needs. I was an anxious little first kid. I wanted everything to be perfect. I lined up everything in my room. All my little strawberry shortcake figures had to be lined up in alphabetical order on my pillow before I'd go to sleep, or I wouldn't sleep. I was one of those kids. Now, the thing is, we look at a 3-year-old and we don't think they have emotional needs because they're so resilient. But we need to start thinking that way because we're missing things. And then I grew up and here I am. Oh yes, I know, friends, right? The Sally Jesse Raphael glasses. Okay, yeah. And those little perfectionist tendencies now were the perfectionist tendencies of a 12-year-old. And everyone just dismissed it and said, oh, rah, rah, rah. But when I got to college, those perfectionist tendencies really hit me hard, and I struggled for a semester. I struggled. Now I made it through, and here I am now. But what if somebody would have said, this 3-year-old girl needs a little bit of coaching. She needs somebody to talk to her and listen. See if a breathing activity or two would help. Now, I had amazing parents, amazing parents. I don't have a tragic story from my childhood. I'm fortunate in that way. I'm privileged in that way. But I also had a mom that would say, you're not going to stay home from school unless you're bleeding out of your eyes. I'll give you something to cry about. A tough, no-nonsense Italian mom. And so what happened is I turned into, when I became an educator, a tough, no-nonsense teacher. I worked with students that I felt were unfairly and often were stigmatized. People had low expectations for them because of where they came from. And so what I did is I walked in the door and I had really high expectations for them. And my students would come to me with an emotional need and I would say, Letizia, mija, no. Work, you're smart, you can do this. And while my students did achieve, I missed opportunities to connect them. I didn't hear them. I didn't see that as part of my job until one of them called me out on it. And then I sat back and it all came at me like a flurry. Wow. My tough love approach, the same tough love approach my mom had for me. Well-intentioned friends, again, out of love, out of commitment to my students, to the community I was there to serve. I was missing these valuable opportunities to connect with my students and serve them better, not just so they could achieve more, which they did once I changed my approach, but because that's part of my job. Part of my job isn't just to teach haiku poetry. My job wasn't just to teach Romeo and Juliet. My job was to teach the whole child. And if I believed that, then that's what I had to start doing. Now I'm going to share a little bit of a video, a segment from the Student Voice Summit. This was a student who was there in New Jersey and who shares her story.
Writing it, I started sharing it with people, and then
let's take a peek.
My teacher suggested that I share it here, and I thought it was extremely important because I'm 18 now, I'm a senior, and I've grown a lot since I was 11 and terrified that if anyone found out that I had anxiety, that I was going to be looked down upon by society. There are some people who still believe that people with anxiety or depression, or now I've been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, those kinds of people like me, have to be a certain way, that we're manipulative or we're lazy or we can't do anything, and that's not true. And the more people who come out and talk about it, the easier it'll be for people who are young getting diagnosed to get the help they need. I know for a fact that if I hadn't been so terrified of my own panic attacks when I was 10, I would have gotten help way earlier than I did, and my life would have been so much easier. So I decided to share breaking out of the ER because this is a discussion that we need to have. It's a hard discussion, but much harder things come out of it if we don't talk about it. There are some people who still believe that people with
And so what we're going to do, friends, is we're going to pause now, and I'm going to ask my friend Stacy to come back on, and she's going to read 3 folks who share their impressions in the chat. These 3 folks will, of course, win Starbucks gift cards. But also, when we take a look at this and we think about hearing student voice to inform how we serve students, what can we do better? Where are there opportunities? Because social emotional learning, mental health, well-being for students, these practices should not happen in silos. And they shouldn't just be for these kids. They're not tier 2, tier 3 measures. They're universal supports for all learners because all learners experience stress. And instead of a bunch of adults sitting around guessing what's happening in a student's brain, how can we say, where do you need support? What do you need? How can we help you? Now, before I turn it over to Stacy, again, because I know and am so proud of Michigan's commitment to suicide prevention. I've included 2 resources here that I rely on quite a bit. These are great organizations to contact. They're great organizations to enlist as thought partners when we think about suicide prevention. Now, there's much more to chat about this, but with our limited time, I want to make sure that I give opportunity for Stacy to share your voices. And I also know that, hey, there probably isn't much PD time left at the end of the school year. And so I don't want to leave you here motivated and ready to go and then say, oops, but there's no PD time. There's no time to train my staff. So let's use these resources here. And then let's use each other. Let's email, let's connect so you can be supported as we roll up. We tie a bow on the end of this school year and we look ahead to the fall. Now, Stacy, please tell me, friend, what are you seeing in the chat?
Well, I can tell you there is so much running through the chat right now, and I'm just going to take a little cross section of what I'm seeing here. But I'm seeing from Cynthia Cook, it's important to listen. From Sarah, listen to students' words, emotions, and body language. From Alexandra, let them know that you are there to listen with only love and no judgment. From Rochelle, continue to advocate for student voice in planning. We are looking at mental health models for next year. We have done the background work. Now principals are charged with working with stakeholder groups, primarily students, to develop that model. What do they need? How are they most likely to use services provided? We need to look kids, and one more from Monica. We need to look kids in the eyes and make sure they feel heard.
Thank you, friends. I love this. Stacy, I'm so impressed with this group. I'm so impressed with this group. Thank you, friends.
I think we should just continue on the rest of the evening.
I know.
Continue an hour.
I know. And
my favorite part of the week.
I know. And when you and I were planning this, we knew this, we needed more time for this one because there's so much rich material here. And so one question we asked last week of the adults, when we think about adult well-being, this is a question we have to ask when we think about student well-being. Are we sending our students the message, it's okay not to be okay? Are we sending them that message? When we think about eliciting student voice and saying, we want to hear from you students, are we tapping our honor roll kids who are going to tell us what we want to hear? The same honor roll kids that we have speak to the school board, the same honor roll kids we feature in the school video. Are we saying all means all? Tell us. Here is space to tell us, whether that telling us is in a restorative justice circle, whether that telling us is it a student forum, small breakout sessions, whatever it might be. Are we creating space? Are we understanding that not all students are comfortable sharing verbally? And so we're going to create nonverbal ways for students to share or anonymous ways for students to share. And understanding that student voice means everybody is at the table and that we're honoring that everyone's point of entry may or may not be different to this work. Some kids are going to be the kid that raised their hand. They're going to jump up to the podium. They're going to grab the mic, and other kids are not, but they still have something to say. And so what we're going to do now, friends, is you've got that paper, you've got that pen close to you, and I'm going to ask you to journal. I'm going to ask you to journal. So those of you that were with me last week, we did a similar activity with defining social emotional learning, what it should, what it shouldn't like, words to use, words not to use. And so I'm going to ask you here to dig a little bit deeper. What should student-centered SEL? That means our implementation, our integration plan. That doesn't mean the curriculum we bought only, even though those are value adds, don't throw it away, but just think about it as a multifaceted approach, a multi-layered approach to SEL. And so we're going to put on a little bit of music for about 90 seconds. And in that 90 seconds, I'm going to have you write and journal, draw, come at this thing. However, what should SEL look like in your schools this fall? Now, I've given you here some words and phrases to use. You see anti-racist and equity there. You see listening to all voices there. You see non-instructional tier 1. Here are some words and phrases to avoid. SEL is not work for problem kids, and hopefully we don't even say problem kids, right? It's not only for exceptional or SPED learners. It's not a crisis intervention. We're going to avoid the mastery conversation and think instead about progress monitoring, which is a more equitable approach to SEL. And we're also not going to think about the social worker will. Social workers are busy. Teachers are busy. Let's think about this in a way where it becomes part of the climate and culture of our buildings, which again is something we'll tackle more in depth next week. But here's we're crafting these approaches, these can-do plans. Let's start to wrestle. Let's start to noodle some of this now. So again, we'll put on a little bit of music. We have 90 seconds. Here we go. Ready to wrap it up? 10 seconds remain. Beautiful, friends. And so notice putting pens down when you're ready and noticing what you included in your list. Now, this is this is a dissertation topic, right? So you're like, really, lady, 90 seconds. I know. But notice what you included. Notice what your go-to pieces were. That's where you can start. That can be your foundation where you build some things you're already undoubtedly doing in your buildings, because I know so many friends here are doing amazing work in your districts. And so noticing what those go-to pieces are and how you can build from there. Now, one thing I'd love for us to hone in on a bit is this permission for students to speak emotions that may make adults feel uncomfortable. When I was a classroom teacher, I was the one that did all my all day Sunday was planning with Post-it notes and chart paper. And then I would come in and I was so excited and energized about a lesson that I expected my students to be as well. And if they weren't, I took it personally. And if they shared emotions with me that they were angry or bored, I'd hit the fan. How dare you be angry in my class? How dare you be anything but thrilled in my class? Don't you love this content as much as I do? It was all about me. And even now with a 6-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son, when I work so hard at being a mom, and Stacy and I have had great conversations around this, and then my daughter will say, I'm upset, I'm depressed. How can you be depressed? Look at you got a puppy for Christmas and a bookshelf full of, how can you be depressed? I take it personally. And so I guilt and I shame emotions instead of receiving them and creating space to be curious. I see a student's anger as a reflection of me as a teacher. My daughter being upset as a reflection of me as a mother. And what I need to do is pause and be curious in the moment. Don't make it about me. Make it about them. And so this takes time and training and grace and compassion, friends. I might have written 8 books on this stuff, but I will tell you, I find myself in these moments regularly. And so I can either judge myself and say, all right, I don't want my daughter to express emotions. I don't want my students to express emotions, because then I just feel guilty that I handled it so badly. And then I try to go back and make nice and it blows up in my face. Or I can be curious. I can apologize when there's a misstep. I can help them coach me, ask them to tell me how to do it better the next time. But to have these critical conversations requires training and coaching. This is not stuff that comes naturally. I'm 45 years old. I wasn't raised with this in my back pocket. Now, some of you were. Awesome. Help the rest of us who weren't. Help facilitate conversations, and administrators and school leaders that are with us, please provide training for your staff members. Even though everyone in your building loves kids, is well-intentioned, and is a nurturing, caring adult, it doesn't mean that these conversations come naturally to them. And that's no fault of theirs. These conversations don't come naturally in life or in society. And so operating with grace and compassion, instead of assuming that adults have capacity to do this. Now, have we adopted state SEL standards? Absolutely. Do the state SEL standards assume competency for all of us? Yeah, they do. So again, what do? We take some steps back and we train up caring adults who want to be there for kids, but may or may not be able to receive, even though their hearts are in it. And so this is ideally what we want. We want students to be able to articulate emotions. I'm angry, I'm anxious, I'm fidgety, I'm tired, and to be able to find a practice that will move them toward being centered and present and ready to learn. This is what we're shooting for here. And so to do that, again, student voice, agency, and positive youth identity are critical. So CASEL has identified these three things as their go-tos for SEL moving forward. They have said loud and proud, everyone, student voice is vital. The ability to act with agency is critical. And that social emotional learning and mental health and well-being support a positive youth development and identity. It's not, I'm broken, something's wrong with me because I have these emotions and feelings and the kid next to me doesn't appear to. And so what does student voice look like? SEL is happening with students arm in arm. There's co-creation. It's not happening to students by adults, designed by adults who are trying to guess what's going on with kids. Student agency. Students have something to do with the emotions that they are experiencing and that they're expressing. That's the pop chart. We pause, we own what's happening with us, and then we find a practice. Whether that practice is breathing or doodling or jumping jacks. We don't care what the practice is, right? We care that our students feel this sense of agency, that they can access practices to move themselves toward that relaxed alertness, to move themselves toward present and ready to learn. And positive youth identity, that a student's story doesn't define them. If they had a hard time, if they're having a hard time, that it doesn't define them. For us as caring adults, then we label that student, even if it's well-intentioned, we lower our expectations. Oh, well, they've got this or that going on at home. No, that we balance that student's social, emotional, their well-being, their mental health needs with expectations. So it doesn't define them in our eyes or for them. Now we say, all right, Carla, you're telling me not to think about mastery, but yeah, I'm investing buku bucks in this stuff. So how do I say to my school board or to my administrators or principals that it's worth the dollars? Okay, I feel you. So I'm sharing here what Chicago Public Schools has shared with us. They're saying, hey, there's some metrics you're already tracking. So what you do is you invest in a multifaceted, multi-layered social emotional learning approach, and you look to track these metrics. You'll notice here, mastery is not one of them. Now I've included here, you'll see increased student SEL skills. That's looking through progress with the lens of progress monitoring. Positive relationships. That's looking through the non-instructional piece. Taking time out of the instructional day, instructional minutes to say, we're going to connect human to human. We're going to build this relationship. Now, can this also happen during instructional time? Sure. And we'll talk about that as well. Now, when do we practice? Let's start. This is where we're going to dig deep here, friends. So when do we practice? When we think non-instructional time, think about the duration is 30 seconds to 3 minutes. We have secondary educators on. Secondary educators, I was one myself. You can't commit 3 minutes because you only got 15 minutes to teach. I get that. So what you do is you think of a way, this is where ed tech and technology comes in, whether you're using Class Catalyst or different mechanism or platform, you're checking in with every student every day so no student falls through the cracks. Notice the frequency piece. This is not crisis intervention. This is checking in with every student every day. This is not a start of the year screener, hoping that we catch those kids in need, because think of how lives change. Think about your past year, friends, during the pandemic. My past year, you asked me, this week I'm great, last week I wasn't, right? Students' lives are shifting. Parents are getting evicted. They're grieving, they're experiencing loss. And so realizing that checking on students' well-being, hearing their voices, both aggregated, collectively, and individual, that has to happen with much more frequency. I love daily. What's the method? It's a pop check. It's Class Catalyst. It's varied opportunities for students' voice, as well as abilities to practice with agency. Now, this happens before instruction begins. So my elementary and early childhood educators, you're building this into your morning routine. For my middle school educators, you're thinking about that advisory period. You're thinking about homeroom, which can also be present in high school as well. But many high schools I know have gotten rid of advisory or homeroom. And so it's the first period of the day. Every first period teacher is expected to have those students check in. And then what does that check-in look like operationally? Now, again, we're thinking about our pop check here, which we practiced as a group. And then here, I've got some graphics to share. And so you'll notice here, I included a school schedule. When you think about operations, I chose 6th grade as a sample, as well as what your pop check could potentially look like. And so here you're thinking about what does this schedule, what could this schedule look like? We're building in a pop check. Now, again, this assumes homeroom, but you may or may not have that at your school and it would need some tweaking. It also assumes that we're doing a quick thumb check with students in the hallway or potentially at the door when they check out. We're thinking about how we operationalize that. So if I have a student in my class that is on Mr. Ruiz's soccer team, and I know that she's really tight with Mr. Ruiz, then I'm going to see him after school and I'm going to say, hey, Mr. Ruiz, I have Tasha on my soccer team. I know that you are really tight. Do you mind checking in with her? I don't have to be that student's person. I have to make sure that student has space to either find a person or communicate with their person. So you notice similarly here, you've got US history. Similar. So you've got, okay, this is a tighter time frame, but we're still engaging with the pop check. We're still posting and working on SEL themes. We've got our pop chart there for students to check in. They pause, they own where they are. You'll see for our pop charts, I have like a little student name where they can move their magnet. Some high school teachers and middle school teachers love this. Some are like, nope, you do you. You know your students. Most importantly, practices are posted, practices are available, and there's time to connect. I don't care if that student writes a Post-it note and puts it on your desk. They have to have the space and time to connect. Now, what could this pop chart look like? This is an example from an elementary teacher, and I love it. Now, she basically took every strategy in my book and put it on one wall. Okay, cool. But you'll notice here, it can also be simple. You've noticed this pop chart here in the corner of the room. You've got the little teddy bear. You've got the little talking stick. It can be simple. It can include our class agreements as well. Make your pop charts your own. Simplify them. Use ed tech when you can, if you can. Now, when do we use ed tech? We use ed tech when technology can do something a teacher can't. A teacher can't feasibly walk around the room and hear from 28 students at one time. And so what technology does is it gives us a way to sort and gather all that student information in 3 minutes, in 2 minutes. And so thinking about whether you use a pop chart, like in the picture, and you check in with those students that might be thumbs down, maybe when they're working in groups, or maybe you can pull them to the side, or use technology like Class Catalyst, which gives you a dashboard of your students that are reporting red that day that then you can connect with, or you can have them connect with a caring adult. But either way, we're building these practices into our non-instructional time. Now, what about during instructional time? During instructional time, again, 30 seconds might be all you've got, or maybe even 10 minutes, depending on your content area. If you're an elementary teacher, you're building this in daily on top of your lesson that you're teaching on at 2:15 on Wednesdays. And so instead of just that 2:15 on Wednesdays, instead we're looking at multifaceted, multi-layered. We're thinking of journeys of protagonists in books. We're thinking about how that protagonist journey can mirror our own. We're thinking about including books, a personal favorite of mine, Jabari Jumps by Gaia Cornwall, or I Like Myself. I also love the Dave Pilkey Dogman series. His new book, Cat Kid, wonderful. And so thinking about whether you're middle school, whether you're high school, for high school, I love Someday a Bird Will Poop on You. I've included some books here, some great SEL books. Now you can screenshot this or again, watch this. We'll send you the links. But thinking about how you can include books and literature and content into your teaching of SEL. Now, whether this is in your instructional time and tied to a lesson, or whether or not this is your window into a conversation with students, because if you're like me, you might struggle with that sometimes. It might not be easy to say, hey, pull up a chair, talk to me about how you're doing. So maybe a conversation or a fun book can be the window into that. Now, what's the elephant in the room, friends? The elephant in the room is, of course, time. And so as we close, I'd like you to think about your action plans. Where are you going to start? Now, this is an interesting place in the school year. We're wrapping things up. We're closing down the school year. So this is a great time to test things out and say to your students, I want to do a better job of SEL next year. I want it to be student informed. I want to hear your voices. Our district's coming up with this plan, or my classroom's coming up with this plan. So I'm going to start with non-instructional time. What do you all think? I'm going to practice this pop check. What do you all think? We're going to try some mindful minutes or some doodling. And then I'm going to recruit the classroom downstairs or the classroom next door or the whole US history department or the whole 6th grade team. And we're going to try it together. And then over the summer, we're going to meet and we're going to reflect. We're going to see what worked and what didn't. And you're eliciting all voices. You're bringing all stakeholders around the table. You're not throwing out the curriculum you bought that was expensive, but you're saying we need other support. So this is multifaceted and we can meet students with varying entry points. Again, you're thinking about voice, agency, and youth identity. Your approach to this is not about evaluating kids on mastery, but you're coming at this with a more equitable lens. You're realizing that student voice needs to be here, look like this or that. And that agency means access to practices. Practices are not one size fits all. And adults, like students, may need help building those powerful human connections that fuel this work. I love this practice here. Asking your students, maybe when you return to school tomorrow, asking adults, maybe when you lead the next faculty meeting, what do you want people to know about you? So as we think about those critical conversations, maybe starting here. Inside the hand, you have folks write things they want to celebrate. Outside the hand, you get folks comfortable talking about challenges, feelings, emotions. And if you role play this with adults, at a faculty meeting, and then you ask adults to teach this to students or to weave this into their lesson. That's the type of coaching and training that our adults need, assuming that they may or may not all have this in their toolbox to start. Now, in closing, I want to invite you all to join us at the Illinois ASCD 4th Annual SEL Summit. I'll be speaking there, as well as my mentor, the fabulous Paul Liebenau, as well as the Michigan virtual team. And in closing, as I turn it over to Stacy, as we did last week, Stace, I'm going to invite friends to email me. What do they have questions on? What do they need thoughts on? What do they need help with? Because this is a lot of information, and potentially for some of us, it's shifting the way that we thought about student SEL. We're coming at this potentially with a different lens. And so friends, know that I am here to support you. You are not alone in this process. This is not simple. It's a lot of work. So if I can't answer your question, the trauma therapist on my team can. The art therapist on my team can. The retired administrator on my team can. We've got you covered, because know that we believe in you, we believe in this work, and that together we're stronger. So please email me now as we close. I'm turning it over to fabulous Stacy. Stacy, what are you seeing in the chat, my friend?
You know, I'm seeing a lot of excitement around having all of these great ideas that are applicable and that can be used in the classroom. I believe it's Claire who says that she loves the hand idea, especially at the beginning of the year as a project. Julia as well. Patrick is saying thank you so much for all the information and the excellent way you shared it. And so I would just agree with everyone here, Carla. This has been amazing. It is always wonderful to learn from you. And thank you for all of the sharing and work you've done around this topic. I will say that if you enjoyed tonight's webinar, we have Carla again with us next week. And we really encourage you to join. She's going to be discussing whole school social and emotional learning and mental health. And I think it'll be very beneficial. And as I mentioned before, if you're unable to attend our webinars, you can always visit us at the link that I added in the chat. And just a reminder to those of you who are on the phone today, you'll want to look in the chat for a link to our form. We cannot identify you from your phone numbers, but if you fill out our form, we can cross-reference it that way. So just again, Carla, we thank you so much. Can't say thank you enough. I mean, tonight I'm running the chat, but I'm also keeping all the notes here. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate you. Appreciate the fabulous Michigan virtual team. And again, we had another week, Stacy, with these amazing participants. These sessions were like everyone just being so involved. I can't wait to pass out those Starbucks gift cards to folks. Look in your email. And again, please email me, email Stacy. We are here to answer your question, friends. Thank you so much.
Yes. And thank you all for joining. I hope you have an amazing evening. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.